Welcome back to App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Vitally and Notion. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well today. We had a good conversation in the pre-show all about a story that you're working on about the iPad, which will be out in, I guess, as people listen to this, a little over a week probably. So stay tuned for that and listen to the pre-show if you want to know more about what Federico's been up to. But today, you and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've learned from WWDC, both kind of the features, the technologies, the APIs, all the things that are available to developers that caught our eye that we thought, that would be really cool if it was in some of the apps we use. And so this is, I suppose, both a preview of things that we think people can look forward to in the fall with their favorite apps, but also maybe a nudge for developers to check some of these things out and see if they can get them ready for the fall, because we'd love to see that stuff in the new apps we test.
Yeah, we always like to round up the developer technologies that are part of the summer announcements for the new operating systems, and hopefully this will translate into new features in our favorite apps in the fall. I think obviously we need to start with arguably what is the most important developer technology this year, which is not a new technology. It's been around for a while, but it's been it's been expanded to new horizons, so to speak, and that's App Intents. So App Intents have been around for a few years at this point, and they are the technology that powers the integration of apps with shortcuts, obviously, but also Siri and, widgets, all these other sort of...
Spotlight search,
like all these other, all these integrations that apps have across the system. These days, they're usually powered by App Intents. Now, what I think is interesting is the multifaceted nature of App Intents. It used to be that, App Intents meant shortcuts. And if you wanted to integrate with the technology, it meant that you were designing a shortcut integration for your app. Now, that's not necessarily the case, because the way that Apple has designed App Intents, they can power radically different types of experiences on your phone and on your iPad. The same intent can be used, for example, in iOS 18 to power a shortcuts action, as well as a control center widget or control center control, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But also, you in the future, down the road, your app integration with Apple Intelligence, for example. So this idea of you build it once and you run it everywhere, I think it's almost like the and don't take this the wrong way, but like it's the Electron of app features, right? In the way that,
it is. I get where you're coming from with that, and it is. This has been like a slow motion story that we've been following for years now, because we've been talking about how here's another thing that's powered by App Intents, and what it was effectively App Intents. I mean, kind of all goes back to the voice assistant and to shortcuts. I don't want to say the name of the voice assistant again, because I just cut out a section of the show where it wanted to run a shortcut for me. In any event, it goes back to that. And it's been expanded over time so that what used to be, like, I think in my mind, a very shortcut specific technology now powers so much that really the shortcuts part of it feels like just a very small piece of a much larger pie, because it's all these other things that you mentioned as well. And what's neat about it is that it both is like a display technology. It lets you take the data out of your app and display it in a place like on a widget for glanceable information, but it's also interactive. And that's where kind of like things like Spotlight search comes into play, and these control center controls and all that sort of thing, where it lets you, and app shortcuts, I guess, for that matter too, which show up in Spotlight search, that lets you interact with your apps from outside of the apps themselves.
Yeah, it almost feels like at this point, Shortcuts is the playground UI for testing App Intents.
It does.
And especially, with the Apple Intelligence features coming in 2025, so the ability for Siri to take action inside of apps, and that will be based on the App Intents API and the new Entities API, which I want to talk about in a second. Okay. But it almost feels like we're going to be using shortcuts to, obviously, like power users like me and you will probably continue building these complex workflows that do multiple things in succession. But it feels like for most people, it kind of feels like shortcuts will be the playground where developers can go in and make sure that their intents and actions are working, and most people will just use the assistant.
I think that's right, and I actually appreciate the way that Apple has developed this, because there are an awful lot of times when all I need is a very simple shortcut, and I have a bunch of utility shortcuts that I've created over the years that are maybe 1, 2, 3 actions. They're not anything incredibly complicated, but by using shortcuts, I can make them available in places where they wouldn't otherwise be available. And now with app shortcuts, a lot of that is kind of done for you. So you don't have to have like hundreds of shortcuts necessarily in a collection in your shortcuts library. You can rely on things like just doing a spotlight search for notes and doing a quick note or something like that.
Yeah. So anyway, speaking of app intents, so if you're a developer, what you should know is that obviously there's, first of all, I think, an important change of direction when it comes to just, if you have an app, how many intents should you support? And
right.
Apple has been pretty clear in this regard. Like, they literally mentioned in a WWDC session how it used to be that their guidance was for developers to only add support for some actions of their apps as app intents. And that guidance has changed with iOS 18 and Apple Intelligence. Apple is now saying that anything your app does should be an app intent. The idea being that they want to make sure that all kinds of functionality that can be performed in an app by a person can also be performed in an app by an assistant and by Apple Intelligence. And that, I think, is the most important change that developers should consider. Like, if you have an app and you've only supported a handful of intents so far for a handful of actions, maybe you should reconsider exposing a lot more functionality to app intents than before.
And it kind of breaks down along the lines that you alluded to, which is these entities and actions, because those are like the nouns and the verbs of the sentences. This is the Beats sentence all over again, right? But for automation, it's you've got your nouns, which are things like, if you're talking about notes, you're talking about the actual note that you're creating. And you've got actions, which are things like create the note or edit the note or append to the note, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So Apple is now, there's this idea of app intents and intents domains, which I'll mention in a second. And then there's entities, which basically entities are like, think of it as objects, basically, right? So for example, if your app is dealing with a document and it's a PDF document, now that's an entity. And one of the things that I think are most important this year and worth keeping in mind is that Apple is basically building this system where entities, so your app's data, they can be presented to another app in a standardized format. So for example, let's say that you have an app to build a trip overseas, and you have all your trip information, your schedule, your itinerary, all those kinds of things. Now, let's say that maybe you want to present all that data to another app. Now you can build an entity that takes all of that trip itinerary and information and presents it in a standardized format, like a PDF or maybe plain text or maybe rich text. Now that's an entity. And with app intents, the beautiful part of this process is that app intents can convert on the fly these entities from, between apps back and forth.
Right.
And the user doesn't have to do anything. So there's also like the changing guidance is also here. It used to be that Apple was saying with shortcuts years ago, we're giving you shortcuts, we're giving you the content graph. It's up to the user to make sure they know how to convert data between actions belonging to different apps. Now, by and large, with this new app intents framework and the new entities API, that burden is falling onto the developers. So the developers need to put in the work to make sure that they expose as many app intents as possible, and they also integrate with entities. There's a new, I don't want this episode to get too technical because I actually want to talk about the end user features, what this will mean for actual people. if developers put in the work, this will mean that in an ideal scenario, multiple apps will be able to actually talk between each other, exchange data, and modify the data. And when I mention modify the data, imagine a scenario in which you have an app that produces a photo and passes that photo to a photo editor. The photo editor has an intent that can rotate the image and pass it back, modified data to the original app without having to create a duplicate, without having to save that file anywhere. That's the ideal scenario in which, sort of the end goal that Apple is sort of driving toward, being able to do these things in succession across multiple apps talking to each other using app intents and entities in the middle. And so if I were a developer, I would totally look into all these changes. There's a new Apple is now categorizing app intents into multiple domains. And there are, I believe, something like 12 new domains to choose from. For example, there's a file management domain, there's a word processor domain, there's a browser domain, there's a document reader domain. And for each of these domains, there's multiple intents and actions that you can incorporate. I believe right now, this summer, developers can build for the mail and photos domains, with more coming in the future. So basically Apple is saying this, make sure that you integrate with app intents, and those app intents will allow you to expose your app actions in shortcuts, but at the same time, coming 2025, this will also mean that with all these new domains and with these hundreds of new actions that are Apple Intelligence understands automatically using the semantic index, Siri will be able to perform actions, based on the user's request inside multiple apps without having to build a shortcut to begin with. And that, I think, is a really exciting opportunity, which is why I think that this summer, in the meantime, developers put in the work to support as many app intents as possible.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it is really exciting. Do you know if the domains are silos? I'm thinking of a scenario, for instance, where what if I have a photo that has text in it and I want to take that text using the text recognition APIs and then send it to a word processor? Those are in separate domains. Can the domains exchange entities, I guess?
Based on my understanding, and again, I don't want this to get too technical, but what Apple is saying is that, so they have these 12 domains with I believe over 100 different actions across 12 domains. And the model, so the Apple Intelligence model, is trained on app intents, and it always expects a particular schema of actions.
Right.
So the way that this works is there's the user request. So there's the user asking Siri to do something, and the request is passed to the model. And the model reasons over the schemas that it understands. Once a schema is identified, an intent is also identified and an action is performed. So at that point, I think it's all up to the model to say, well,
got it.
What schema am I supposed to work with, and what intent am I supposed to find? That, I think, is a question that I cannot answer today. Apple has only explained the structure of a request. So what happens, from the moment the user asks something to the moment a result is presented.
Right.
And they have said our model has been trained on app intents. And the model has been trained on this, over 100 new actions across 12 domains. And the model expects a particular schema or a particular shape. Right? So when you ask the model, hey, I want to take text from a photo, that will be interesting to see what the model understands. And we don't have any demos to go by right now because Apple hasn't showed them.
Yeah, that's the magic that we are still waiting to learn, I suppose. And that's what's going to be interesting about this year, because we're going to have, we're going to do reviews this fall, and there's large swaths of information that we were given in very broad brush at WWDC that aren't going to be part of those OSs yet. It's going to be a long, slow update process, I think, going into 2025. But yeah, I'm really excited about these app intents. I think they're a great thing.
Yeah, and all this stuff, by the way, with Siri taking actions inside of apps, that will be 2025 anyway. So what I'm saying is that in the meantime, developers should look into the App Intents API, the new documentation. Make sure that you build as many shortcuts actions as possible, because right now that's all we have. It's shortcuts actions. And
this episode of App Stories is brought to you by Vitally. Vitally brings a new era to customer service productivity with their all-in-one platform. Vitaly's collaborative workspace combines your customer data with all the capabilities you expect from today's project management and work platforms. With Vitally, you can measure the effectiveness of OKRs and operational strategies on customer outcomes at scale thanks to their Goals feature. Goals allows you to track the progress of your account against target metrics, meaning you could standardize goal setting across the board so you could know exactly how effective your processes really are. And best of all, it's designed for today's customer success team. That's why Vitally operates with unparalleled efficiency, improves net revenue retention, and delivers best-in-class customer experiences. Vitally is offering a free pair of AirPods Pro for every App Stories listener who books a qualified meeting. So if you're a customer success decision maker, schedule your call by visiting vitally.io/appstories. That's vitally.io/appstories for a free pair of AirPods Pro when you schedule a qualified meeting. Our thanks to Vitally for their support of the show.
that leads me into the second thing I wanted to mention, the customizable control center with the controls API. So those are also based on App Intents, but the controls are built using WidgetKit. So WidgetKit is another existing technology that's being used to power home screen widgets and lock screen widgets. Now, using WidgetKit, you can build controls for the new customizable control center. Now, there's two types of controls. There's a button and there's a toggle. The button performs something in your app. The toggle changes the state of something. These actions are built using App Intents. So the things that are actually performed are performed with App Intents. And these controls are built with WidgetKit, and they can also be customized just like WidgetKit. So they're basically widgets that live in Control Center, and also, I should note, at the bottom of the lock screen, because finally you can also swap the flashlight and camera buttons for something else.
Oh, very cool. Have you tried any of these third-party ones? I have a third-party.
You do?
No,
I don't. What do you have? Can you talk about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I can. I've been holding out on you. I've written about the app Paku, I think it's pronounced Paku, which is
it the air quality app?
It is, and it has a control widget that fires off its live action. So if you activate it, it's a circular one, and it's a toggle that if you turn it on, it starts the live activity. If you tap it again, it ends the live activity, and the live activity tells you what the air quality is. It's quite well done. It's quite a handy thing. Now, of course, you can expand it, but yeah, it's my first experience with it, and it's quite well done.
Yeah. So as users, what can we expect here? First of all, controls from your favorite apps will be able to support multiple sizes. They can be little circular ones that only show a symbol. Mm-hmm. They can be rectangles. They can be squares. And the squares, for example, they can show a symbol. They can show a title. They can show a value as text. So if you're a developer, you should look into this. Make sure you use a nice symbol and a descriptive title and some text to indicate the value of something. Like, is the alarm of my custom home automation app, is the alarm turned on or turned off? Like that sort of stuff you can display in a control. Right. And also, like, as I mentioned, these controls are user configurable. They work exactly like widgets. You long press them and you configure the back panel of the control. For example, if you have, a time tracking app and you want to start a specific timer, like that sort of stuff. And also, this control, like developers, can sync the states of controls between devices if they have a server and if they use push notifications. So you may expect that, for example, if there's an app that has an iPhone and iPad version, if the developers of the app do the work, they could sync the state of a control between devices using their server and
Very
notifications
nice.
between the iPhone and iPad. Yeah. And lastly, before we move on to other topics, I also wanted to mention regarding widgets, if you are a developer, I would advise that you build multiple sizes of the same widget type. Because in iOS and iPadOS 18, you can finally resize widgets from small to medium and large. And it appears that the system automatically scales the same widget. So what I mean by this is, let's say that you have a today widget for your task manager that shows you the tasks due today. If you have the same widget offered in multiple sizes, users will be able to resize that widget on the home screen, just like on macOS, basically, without having to delete the widget and re-add it in a different size every time.
I've actually really been enjoying that. I mean, I haven't been adding a ton of widgets this summer, but I have enjoyed playing with that because I think it's so much handier and useful than the old thing where you had to delete it, put in a new widget, and then configure it each and every time. So that's going to be really nice. All right, Federico, we should talk too about, I want to mention something that's probably pretty geeky too, but it's worth highlighting because one of the topics at WWDC was improvements to Core ML. And I'm not going to get into the details of this. I haven't really focused on the nitty gritty myself, but I think that the punchline is worth mentioning for users because these improvements to Core ML at least are advertised as helping with both natural language processing, sound analysis, and vision intelligence. So this is all on Apple Silicon, whether that's, an iPad or a Vision Pro or a Mac or whatever. But those are all the kinds of things that I think as Apple Intelligence rolls out, they're going to be useful to apps in ways that they haven't been before, where people are using their voice to interact with apps or, detecting sounds around them in order to perform actions inside particular apps. I think it's going to be interesting to see where that goes, but I think it's one of those things that Core ML, I think, doesn't have the broad adoption that some other APIs do, primarily because historically the use cases were fairly limited. But I think with some of these advancements this year in particular, it's going to become relevant to a much wider audience of developers. And as a result, I think users are going to see it in more contexts.
Yeah, that's very cool. All right, so I have a list of other developer technologies that I want to mention.
Okay.
One of them that I think is pretty neat is the new Translate API. So obviously Apple has been building the Translate app for the past few years. And there's, for the past few years, there's also improving in iOS 18, but it's not a new feature. There's a better support for like multilingual users. So there's the new design for the multilingual keyboard, and I believe Siri supports to some extent multilingual responses now. That's something that I need to check. That is some mention on Reddit.
You should mention what the multilingual keyboard is all about, because I have that actually activated right now, because I had the Italian keyboard activated when I was going through Italian classes on Duolingo. And this is a big improvement, I think, to what it used to be.
Yeah, so it's not a new feature in the sense that we've been able to type in multiple languages on the iPhone for a few years now. But you had to add multiple keyboards to the software keyboard setting in the settings app to do that. Like you needed to say, in addition to English, add the Italian keyboard. And that meant that you had to, you could type in Italian while in the English keyboard without switching views, but the keyboard had to be added. Whereas now, the keyboard is more like unified in the sense that you can just add multiple languages, and the one keyboard will say English and Italian in the bottom right corner, and that's you can just use one keyboard, and that's it. Like it's been streamlined.
Yeah, before you had to cycle between them, and sometimes autocomplete would work better in one language versus another, and there are various other differences between using one language's keyboard and another language's, and this kind of squishes it all together in a way.
Yeah. But the new translation API, so this is based on the technology that powers the Translate app. Now, developers can integrate a powerful translation API directly with their app's interfaces. So you can translate stuff, multiple strings of text at once. You can show, translations in line. Yeah, you don't have to show any custom branded UI for a translation. You can incorporate a button in your app's interface, and you can offer a translation for multiple strings of text. The system will take care of prompting users if it needs to download languages for the translation, which is an asynchronous process that will continue in the background. So yeah, what this means for users, once again, it means that starting later this year, you may notice that in some of your favorite apps, there will be a translation feature, or maybe some apps that already have a translation feature will change from the Google Translate provider to the Apple Translation API, which in theory should be easier to use, faster, because it gets downloaded on device and it doesn't require an internet connection, and it's of the same quality as the Translate app.
Yeah, I could see this being a big deal for everything from read later apps to cooking apps, for instance, where you come across an English language recipe, for instance, on some website, and you want to translate it into French or Spanish or Italian or whatever it happens to be. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Notion. There's so much to love about Notion. It's a great product management tool, but it also works for your personal projects as well. That's because it's incredibly flexible. We've used it for things like the relaunch of Club Mac Stories a few years ago. It was perfect for project planning, creating documentation, tracking tasks, and all that sort of thing for a multi-person team. But I've also used it just to store my notes and figure out what it is that I want to address each week. It's really perfect that way. Notion is a place where any team can write, plan, organize, and discover the joy of play. And more recently with Notion AI, you can do things like take those notes and pull out all the actionable items from them or summarize them. It's a great way to leverage artificial intelligence to organize your day and all of your documentation. Notion is a place where any team can write, plan, organize, and rediscover the joy of play. It's a workspace designed not just to make progress, but to get inspired. It's an AI-powered workspace where things just take care of themselves. Meetings get summarized, documents find themselves, and every question has an answer. Notion AI turns knowledge into action, from summarizing meeting notes and automatically generating action items to getting answers to questions in seconds. If you can think it, you can make it. And it's for everyone. Whether or not you're a Fortune 500 company, a freelance designer, starting your new startup, or a student juggling classes and clubs. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/appstories. That's all lowercase letters, notion.com/appstories to start turning ideas into action. And when you use our link, you'll be supporting our show. That's notion.com/appstories. Our thanks to Notion for their support of the show. All right, Federico, we should talk a little bit about SwiftUI, because one of the things that I gathered from speaking to developers at WWDC is that there are continuing performance enhancements to SwiftUI. And, SwiftUI is what allows developers to create user interfaces that work across different platforms, different Apple platforms. And one of the things that I know some developers struggled with at times was with complex views in their apps, and SwiftUI not being very performant in that context, where there would be, animation glitches or stuttering or things like that. And some of the situations where you could find that would be in the chart creation tools that we saw a lot of apps start adopting last year, or very complex table views. There are various apps that I've seen where this has become an issue over time, but that is improving this year. So I think it should be both. It should make developers' lives easier. There will be fewer hacks that have to be done to kind of work around some of these slowdowns. And for users, it'll just mean not only that the apps that they're already using will perform better, but I think we'll see more apps adopting some of these tools than have in the past, because perhaps they tried, but they just couldn't get it up to a level of quality where they wanted to release it. Instead, now more charts, more complex views, all going to be possible as part of SwiftUI, which is good because SwiftUI obviously it started very rudimentary several years ago, and now it's a lot better than it's ever been, and that just means that apps are going to scale a lot better all the way from the watch all the way up to the Mac.
Yeah, that's very cool. Let's see if I have anything else that I want to mention. Yeah, so there's one more thing. No, there's two more things that I want to mention.
Okay, I've got one more too.
Okay, so the first one is if you are a developer of an app to set up a hardware accessory, there's a brand new AccessorySetupUI in iOS and iPadOS 18 that basically mirrors the setup UI of AirPods. And basically this new, it's called the AccessorySetupKit prompt. It basically unifies multiple permissions into a single new prompt UI that's similar to AirPods setup. Specifically, it condenses the Bluetooth permission, the Wi-Fi permission, and the accessory management like Bluetooth pairing request all in one screen. Like it's just one card that pops up from the bottom of the display, just like, when you're setting up an AirPod, and it basically cuts down the number of standalone permission prompts. It's much nicer. Developers can customize it with the title. They can customize it with artwork. So yeah, if you work on the iOS app for a physical accessory that a user can set up on their iPhones, there's a brand new, it's part of the privacy enhancements of iOS 18. There's a brand new AccessorySetupKit setup technologies to simplify setup and make it more accessible and easier and faster to use.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, having just set up a pair of the Sennheiser Momentum 4 Sport Bluetooth headphones not long ago, that would have been really handy just to have that card pop up like it does with AirPods instead of dealing with, various Bluetooth permissions and that kind of thing.
And lastly, I want to mention the updated Journal API.
Oh, sure.
So this is the API for the Journal app, and there are some enhancements in terms of journal suggestions. So these are the suggestions that are gathered by the Journal app and the Apple system. So there's nothing developers can do to tweak the algorithm to suggest new stuff. This matters, this Journal Suggestions API, it matters for developers of third-party journaling apps that want to integrate with Apple suggestions. There's new types of suggestions. There's the state of mind, which is based on what we saw in Apple Health. There's the motion activity suggestions. They now support more types of activities for people who don't have an Apple Watch. And there's one that I'm really excited about. It's called Generic Media. The Generic Media suggestions will suggest media. I know, the name says
Generic Media.
It's called Generic Media. It suggests music and podcasts that come from non-Apple applications.
Oh, all right. That makes sense. Yeah.
So in theory, it means that what I listen to in Pocket Casts should be able to appear in the Journal app and in Journal Suggestions in third-party journaling apps.
That probably doesn't make a difference for an app like Marvis Pro, though, does it? Since that's operating through Apple Music.
That one doesn't. Oh, I should also mention that apps that offer generic media, if they don't want to show up in Journal Suggestions, they can opt out. I think it's based on the Now Playing API. So if you're the developer of Spotify or Podcast, I hope you don't, but if you want, you can opt out. And lastly, I should mention the reflection prompts. Those are also part of the Journal API now. So those can also show up in the suggestions API inside Day One or Everlog, any of these third-party journaling apps that integrate with the journal suggestions.
Yeah, maybe the scrabbling apps will do this, Federico. We'll get Last.fm apps that will suggest inside of journaling apps because
technically they probably could. We'll have to see.
It's hard to know.
But it's hard to know, and I don't have any beta to confirm this right now. I checked in iOS 18 beta 1. The journal app itself was not picking up what I was listening to in podcasts.
Okay.
So we'll see if that becomes available automatically at some point later this summer in the beta cycle.
All right. Well, I'm going to close out with one last one, which is kind of returning to where we started, which is another very geeky topic, which is embedded Swift. And this is something that's not entirely new, but Apple has been, I think they literally talked about embedded Swift when Swift was first introduced, but it's really progressed quite a bit, especially this year. And the reason I know about this is because my son Finn has been working with embedded Swift, which allows you to run Swift on and write for devices that are constrained in terms of their compute power. And so, like, for instance, what he's been doing is he's been working on a set of tools so that developers can write Playdate games using Swift for the Playdate handheld game device. And he has most recently done a demo of running Swift on an actual Game Boy, where you can write a game in Swift, and then you can run it on not only an emulator on modern hardware, but you can actually run it on a Game Boy itself if you put it on a cartridge and put it in the slot, which is pretty wild when you think about it. And what excites me about it is that, these are just kind of experiments to see if it works. But the fact that it does means that the legions of iOS developers and Mac developers and whatnot who all know Swift already are now potentially able to create things for other kinds of hardware using Swift, which I think is a good thing because it'll only make those ecosystems more rich along the way.
Finn, listen to me. I got $1 billion idea for you.
What's
that? This is a galaxy brain idea. So, well, you know how Delta is the most popular app on the iPhone App Store?
Yeah.
And you have embedded Swift. A match made in heaven would be an app that lets you create games for Delta. Delta is a Game Boy emulator. Finn is working on a system to use embedded Swift to produce Game Boy games. But why put them on a cartridge? Play them in the most popular iPhone app ever made, Delta. So you should consider a Delta game maker of sorts that, lets you put together simple games and exports them as Swift embedded code that can be compiled as a Game Boy game for Delta.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea because he actually has demoed that project using Delta. So, I mean,
see, there you go.
It's definitely possible to do that. All right, Federico, good conversation today. I want to thank our sponsors again for this episode. That's Vitally and Notion. You can find Federico and me over at MacStories.net. We're on Mastodon. Just go to Viticci.MacStories.net or JohnVorhees.MacStories.net to follow us there. And I should mention that if you follow MacStories on Mastodon, you will start seeing, at least in the official app and on the web, little links at the bottom of any posts from MacStories showing the author name, not just me and Federico, but Nilian and Devin and Jonathan, whoever writes a story. There's going to be a link at the bottom with their little avatar. You can click on it and you can go right to their profile and follow them. So you not only can follow MacStories, but you can follow all the authors very easily with this new feature. We are also on Threads and Instagram, where Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.